everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the second event in our Ethnic Studies guest speaker series. Today we'll be welcoming Dr. Samantha de Vera. Dr. de Vera is assistant professor in history at UC Irvine, whose research focuses on 19th century African American history, specializing in Black movements, activism, and organizing. Her talk today is titled Pedagogical Approaches to Black History and Digital Humanities in the Age of AI. Please join me in welcoming Dr. de Vera.
Thank you. It's actually so nice to see so many students here who are really willing to engage in these talks. I myself was before UCSD and before all that, and UCI, where Jose and I were PhD students at UCSD together. You came a year after I did, or 2 years. Yeah. I was at a community college where I started my college career rather late. And I did not think that I would do a PhD until someone said it's free to do a PhD. So, and I ended up doing it. So, like many of my fellow historians, I've dabbled with AI chatbots, curious to know how AI would append my course assignments, my syllabus, my job, the discipline of history, and perhaps eventually even humanity. And thoughts of doom seemed to be very unavoidable, and the threat felt even more real as my institution, UC Irvine, gave all the students free access to ChatGPT without notifying its faculty or even providing any training or workshop on how to avoid cheating when AI is so widely used. And more recently, of course, Cal State proudly launched a course ran entirely on AI. And they proudly said, no human instructor involved. ChatGPT, as many of you know, is an AI-run platform, chat platform. You can ask it to write a response. You can feed it documents. You can ask it to define concepts, and even write an essay for you if you know how to write the prompt well. And of course, like many instructors, I despaired. You know, as much as I want to believe my students were interested in my lectures, I know this TikTok generation are being reprogrammed to have an attention span that is quite short. But you know, I thought I myself used AI. As a digital humanities scholar, I've asked AI to organize my data and to provide me with some HTML codes that I've long forgotten. And I didn't trust AI's I don't trust its knowledge yet, right? But I trusted its organizing capabilities as if it was a meticulous secretary, kind of speeding up this tedious process of data entry. And as a historian of the experiences of African Americans in the 19th century US, I constantly find myself grappling with an existential question, right? Can America save itself in the age of misinformation and alternative facts? And this problem, it seems to me, is being exacerbated by the uncritical use of AI. So, Black Americans brought upon the second founding of this nation. We know that during the Reconstruction, they were really driven by the dream of freedom, equal rights for all. If only my students knew what the task ahead, what what lay ahead of us as a task, and as we witness the rise of American fascism, if we're not there yet. If only they knew in the same way that formerly enslaved people knew that this task is what they have to pick up, and that they have to pick up every tool on hand, a hoe, a hammer, a gun, and engage in a glorious strike for freedom against the disease that has plagued America for 400 years, chattel slavery. Many enslaved people were illiterate. They were forced into illiteracy to keep them subjugated, yet they knew it was time to fight when it was time. The time is now, and the revolutionary impulse was not lost to them. And now we find ourselves with white supremacy reigning in the halls of the government. And I stared at my own students. Do they know how urgent things are? How can they not see the vicissitudes of our political circumstances? And I always think, Black history will always be riveting and fascinating to me. But I always wondered, how do I get my students to understand history in the age of AI? An era of unprecedented accessibility to information, yet somehow vetted quality information has become rare. How do I teach history so that students would have the right foundations to understand what is going on in this country? I don't believe my job is to politicize students. My job is to teach people how to separate fact from fiction, to teach them how to critically analyze the information that they are bombarded with on a daily basis. I don't politicize my students, but I do build up their political consciousness. So students can better understand their very positionality in this world and decide independently how they're gonna navigate it and navigate it ethically. So with this in mind, with all these questions in mind, I changed my pedagogical approach. So these days, I privilege student engagement over point accumulation, knowledge production over memorization, and as we know, history tends to have a lot of dates, and collaboration over individual tests. In a world that's increasingly disengaged from reality, it made sense to compel students to engage with one another, to talk to one another over a document, an archival document that's 160 years old, to force them to think how historical events reverberate in their lives. So recently, I taught two sections of an introductory class on the 19th century US history. Each of these classes had 200 students. And, with the University of California chancellor's recent salary increases to the tune of about, $250,000, they told us faculty that austerity has forced them to cut my TA numbers to half, 4 TAs for 400 students, and a very well-deserved $250,000 to our chancellor. So with this in mind, I got rid of my exams, I got rid of essays. There's no point in assigning essays and forcing my TAs to read AI-generated writing. And I'm really not willing to police 400 students. And inspired by my work at the College Conventions Project, which is committed to open access interactive learning, I became an expert on the colored conventions and Black organizing in the 19th century, not because I read all the books about it or wrote my dissertation on it. There was not a lot of scholarship on it. I became an expert because I created many exhibits for the project and did all the necessary archival research, and I totally enjoyed it. So if you're wondering, the Colored Conventions Project is a digital humanities project that explores the organizing histories of Black Americans in the 19th century. So starting in 1830, free Black people, many of them have liberated themselves from enslavement. They held these political conventions independent of white allies. We think about anti-slavery back then, and what we always think about as white abolitionists when there are so many Black activists that are sort of marginalized in the archives. In these conventions, they petitioned to Congress, they protested against the US government, they mobilized amongst themselves, and they strategized towards equal rights. This was 1830, not 1960s, not 1920s. Black political consciousness has a long, rich history that stretched far beyond and before the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And so this project, the Color Conventions Project, centers these histories. And it feels even more urgent now to do so, to be part of this project when the federal government is actively trying to erase Black history and LGBTQ history, LGBTQIA history, women's history, and anything that is not about white men. And this is, of course, a very violent erasure that's meant to keep us ignorant, an effort to make people think less, to decimate our critical thinking abilities so that we can absorb and accept white supremacy as a norm without a question. When we don't study history, we fail to recognize the hallmarks of fascism. That's what's at stake. How do I show my students what's at stake? That is the question that has been preoccupying me as I prepared to teach a class with very indifferent students. AI chatbots, as many instructors know, is a challenge, but I thought engagement is key. And I took, again, inspiration from my work with the Colored Conventions Project. So if you go to the site, you will find that there are a lot of exhibits on Black organizing that's interactive, and there are a lot of maps in it. And as you can probably tell if you ever go to it, the project is itself a community. It's a labor of love. It's human collaboration. It's a human commitment to the importance of Black history. So here we collaborated with Mural Arts Philadelphia about 3 years ago, yes, to create 2 murals in the Black community in Southwark. That historically, this community historically fought for their housing rights. And that's a sort of a hidden history. And what we did was we had these 2 murals side by side, one about 19th century Black activists and the other one about current modern day activists. So in doing that, we brought together historians, local activists, organizers, artists, and the residents of this community. So here, what you see is history and the present were side by side. The traditions of resistance and resilience lives on. And so as I reflected on my work, AI cannot do what I do. I put my heart in my work. I felt close to Black activists, historical Black activists that I studied. And in a way, I wanted students to feel the same. Let me pivot a little and to show you what AI can do. Just a snippet of it. It can do a lot of things. So this is Gamma AI, and what it is a presentation generator that can create slides for you, presentation slides. And so I fed it the topic free Black communities in Philadelphia during the early 19th century. And it gave me the option of making a detailed presentation, or as it says, moderately detailed, web images or AI images. I chose detailed and web images, and this is what it gave me. These are a series of slides that don't really say anything. On the surface, it is aesthetically very pleasing, but substance-wise, it is empty. AI knows how to co-opt the language of activism and liberation. It knows how to fluff up pieces. And as you can probably tell, if I had prompted AI to make slides about Black New York in the early 19th century, it would most likely just substitute Philadelphia with New York and give us the same superficial information about Black institutions and city populations. AI cannot relay the compelling history of Black Philadelphia. It cannot convey how exciting I find this topic to be. Same excitement I get whenever I research Black history. So here's the archival research-based presentation that I use for my classes. For a survey class filled with STEM students and international students, I use timelines and maps because, again, I want to convey how compelling this history is, while being mindful that not everyone is a history buff. This particular lecture, as you can tell, is about Black Philadelphia and early America, and I focus on the establishment of the first independent Black denomination, the American Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, and how that's connected to the colored conventions movement. Essentially, what I wanted to show them is that it takes a community to fight against oppression, and we cannot ignore the work of Black people who pushed for true democracy from the very beginning of this nation. So here are the maps that I put together. These are all from online archival sources. And again, AI can't put together these maps because it's not there yet. I've scrolled through the streets of Philadelphia. I know all these spots, and I sourced these historical maps online, and I put them together. And this is really where my training as a historian and, of course, my dream of being a graphic designer merge. Visually engaging slides and historical materials, I find helps with engaging students. 19th century US is a hard sell for students who are in STEM and only taking this class as a requirement. The way I approach it is, how do I get them to see how important this history is, how relevant it is to what is happening right now? Showing them where these activist traditions emerged, in this case, Philadelphia, where Black women and men built a thriving community against all odds since the nation's founding, right? And I like to center the lives and labors of activists themselves. Many of them died without ever seeing the demise of chattel slavery. And this is the historical resilience that I wish for us to emulate. But I do know that for many of us, they have to learn about it first. So this is another sample of a map that I put in my classes. So this is a map of New York. Everyone knows, they are familiar with it. But what if I take them back in time and compare it to an older map, and somehow it becomes more familiar? You can still visit Five Points today. It looks nothing like what it did now. So the reason why AI cannot replicate this yet is the precise attention to detail, to where and how historical actors lived and what made each individual unique and significant. That's the work that I put into it. AI, of course, has no heart. It cannot speak to the experience of doing research. And the more we, as historians, figuratively bring the students to the archives, the more valuable the work of history appears. By the way, I'm a PowerPoint expert, so all these slides are all PowerPoints, and I create them from scratch. I also give workshops on how to make educators' slides more engaging. So back to my pedagogy. As an assignment, I actually share my own archival documents for my own research to my students. This particular one is from the Library of Virginia, which is an amazing archive. And what I have students do is transcribe the register of the Virginia State Penitentiary, as well as the pardon requests of imprisoned persons to the governor. So what we ended up with was this very rich set of data. This was just a sample of it. There's thousands of it. And these records fit well within our discussions about 19th century prisons, including the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which is the oldest prison in this country, and of course the various models of penal reforms of the era. These are also records from my book project about the incarceration of Black refugees from slavery during the Civil War under the Union Army. So during the Civil War, refugees from slavery and freedmen experienced the power of the federal government through incarceration. What I show my students is that by engaging with archival materials, they can find a wealth of knowledge that contradict the oft repeated myths that many Americans have come to embrace as the truth. In this case, as my book project will show, right, we see the Union Army itself, not an army of deliverance, but they themselves were incarcerating emancipated African Americans, depriving them of the promises of freedom after they, African Americans, brought about the end of the war and the death of chattel slavery. Angela Davis says freedom is a struggle. It's a constant struggle. Even in the most radical era in this nation's history, the Reconstruction, when African Americans became citizens and Black men got the vote, freedom was a constant struggle. And even before chattel slavery was declared constitutionally illegal, white citizens, the federal government, and state governments already found ways to extract labor from Black people. The 13th Amendment did not strike down slavery. It preserves slavery as a punishment for a crime. And this is, of course, not new. We see the language, this same language, in Thomas Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance and, of course, the Wilmot Proviso. And more recently, California, our great state, voted to keep slavery in prisons. We decided as a state that prison slavery is acceptable, that it was an acceptable form of coercion, of coerced labor. So I asked my students as they pored over these records and listed the names of freedmen captured by the white supremacist carceral apparatus of the state. From the perspective of an imprisoned worker, how much progress have we made since 1865? And of course, having exposed them to archival documents, I then prompted them to do a mini archival research. And so that brings me to my next point, knowledge production over memorization. So again, instead of asking my students, these non-history majors, to write an essay on a topic they just learned about, or instead of testing them on historical facts, I focus on making them do research themselves and to take the lead on it. So for this particular assignment, I asked them to pick a historical figure whom we've discussed, and then, excuse me, and then they find primary sources about these persons that they chose. And they need to use archival databases for this. And this is my somewhat AI-proof assignment. It's not completely immune to cheating, but as an instructor who was not equipped by UCI with any tools or training to avoid cheating with AI, I did not want to waste my time policing students' works. I do believe that is a waste of time. Again, this assignment is about reflecting. Besides just fact-finding, students find the primary sources and they have to answer questions about how. How? How did you pick your topic and why? What methods worked in finding your sources? What methods did not work? You specifically talk about the process. How would you build an essay about this? The more personal the question, the less effective AI is. And questions like this compel students to look inward, right? How do I do historical research? How do I separate valuable information in a sea of unreliable information? Or worse, misinformation. And so I will be teaching this class again next year. And my next assignment will delve deeper into analyzing archival documents. For history or ethnic studies professors here, feel free to steal this assignment. I will be asking my students next year to investigate the lives of Chinese immigrants during the Chinese exclusion era of the late 19th century. Many of you know that, that California in the 19th century was the bedrock of racially restrictive immigration laws, the legacies of which we still grapple with today. My students are mostly international students from China, so I figured this is a way to get them engaged in historical research, no matter their background. And this is, of course, in no way an appeasement toward international students who are, as I like to say, the cash cow of the UCs. The Chinese exclusion era is actually quite integral to my class on the 19th century, as well as my classes on Black movements and US slavery. Here, I connect the experience, the immigrant experience, with the issues that arose post-slavery, right, or post-emancipation. So Chinese exclusion was a California white supremacist dream, as I like to call it, that came true. Californians in the 19th century was at the forefront of these racist immigration policies. It is here in the state that politicians claim that in order to protect the gains of the Civil War and Reconstruction, in order to protect the nation from slavery, they have to include or they have to block all quote unquote Chinese slaves from coming to the country's shores. They branded all Chinese persons as unthinking slaves of the emperor, thereby bastardizing Black Americans' dreams of freedom in order to exclude another racial group. I want students to see firsthand the vestiges of these exclusionary policies against immigrants. So this picture that you see here is actually, this is a certificate of residence. This is a all Chinese migrants were required to carry this at all times. This is the progenitor of the green card. You might say it's the first kind of green card. And if you were found without it, then as a Chinese person, you would be deported immediately, no trial whatsoever. And so for this assignment, I will actually be asking students to analyze the case files of Chinese migrants apprehended by state officials, to find out what happened to them and to hear the voices of these migrants who were interrogated and eventually a lot of them deported. These case files are actually freely available on the National Archives website. The National Archives, if it continues to be funded, is trying to digitize them all. So my students will be reading this very carefully with the knowledge that archival materials produced by the state itself are replete with violence. These records were not meant to humanize, but rather to strip immigrants of their humanity, to deem them as quote unquote illegal aliens. No one, of course, is ever illegal, but the state insists on that label. This assignment is not just a fact-finding endeavor. That's easy enough. You can feed this document to ChatGPT or Claude AI, and it will summarize the case file for you quite nicely, actually. But this assignment is more reflective, and students are required to talk about the process again, the process of finding out, the process of creating a narrative out of one person's tragic experience. I do realize this assignment is an emotional task. I understand we know that currently the state does not respect legal status documentation of immigrants anymore. The state illegally detains people to, ironically, deem them illegal. The bounds of coercion has expanded, and we consent to this by letting it happen. And I don't intend to scare my students with this assignment. I know that many of them are already aware of the precarity of their situation. I do not intend to politicize. I help build political consciousness. I don't even tell them that the personal is political. I let them find that out for themselves. Because as their bourgeois dreams of a degree from an American university is threatened by the current administration, they will find, and they find, the personal is political, and it has always been. One of my students showed me his Chinese grandfather's certificate of residency, exactly the same certificate that I just showed you before. And this was surprising. I didn't even have to tell him, of course, that the past is always with us, that our histories mattered. He knows. The personal has always been political. AI will not help students to build their political literacy. AI cannot go to the archives and compel my students to investigate the past that is so deeply connected to them. AI can organize your dates, make fancy graphics, write your itinerary for a vacation, but it cannot and will not make one politically literate because it's not meant for that. Yes, I've despaired and of course I've marveled at its capabilities, but what personal history can AI share with you? What human experience can it talk about to you? So, onto my other approach, collaboration. So instead of individual exams, I ask students to form groups of 5. This makes it easier for a class that has 400 students. And each group had to create a map. And each map should have several place marks, as you can see here. And all of these should be based on archival documents. So my students would have to source those archival documents and place them on the map that they created themselves. And they have to provide an explanation for each. So ArcGIS is what I use. This is provided by UC Irvine to its students. It's a geospatial mapping tool that allows them to create these interactive maps. And throughout the quarter, I trained my students on the basics of ArcGIS. It's a skill that I make sure to tell them it cost me $3,000. And I cannot tell you how glad I was as an instructor, again, in a predominantly STEM institution, to see this notoriously indifferent group of students excited about the humanities. My colleagues have, in fact, warned me about these students, about this class. In fact, one colleague said that they were borderline alcoholic when they were teaching it. But I have a different experience. Here I see them researching historical topics that are interesting to them, that are connected to them. My international students from China decided to map Chinese businesses in California from 1850 to 1900. This particular map that you see here is actually from the 19th century Black movements class, where I talk a lot about movements and institutions that emerged in Philadelphia and in general in the 19th century. They also had to collectively write a narrative. The development of that narrative I could see because I give them a channel where they can collaborate. And I actually quite enjoy reading my students' chats because that's engagement, right? And I see collaboration and I see learning. And most of all, they held each other accountable. You know, the work had to be equally distributed. And this way, I don't have to police them. I mean, this is the kind of work that I already do for the Color Conventions Project. And truly being a part of a public history project that seeks to educate a broader audience and to make people proud of Black heritage in their communities, that has driven me and also has changed how I teach, I think, for the better. This other map is one group created a map of, I think they're in biology. Their majors are bio-related, so they decided to map the cholera epidemic in 1866 in Manhattan, New York, and they created a heat map. And we talk about the value of mapping these things, right? If you're able to create a map, you see the concentration over here, and then perhaps something is wrong with the water source there. that caused all this sickness. So I want to conclude with this message that when education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is not to free the world of oppression. Their dream becomes to be an oppressor themselves. And yes, AI is very sophisticated and it can write your essays. But if we keep relying on AI to do the thinking for us, our mind will remain stagnant and imprisoned, essentially, and our dreams very narrow. AI, of course, is not there yet. It cannot replicate emotion and the devotion we have for our histories. And perhaps one day it can come close, and I'm almost sure it will come close to replicating the human mind. But as a humanist, I remain optimistic that maybe we can steer the development of AI toward enriching the humanities to make education liberating, not just easy. Because if AI is not in service of true education, of freeing one's mind, then it's just a tool of coercion. The powers that be are simply expanding the bounds again of what is acceptable types of coercion to force us into obscurity and to force us into irrelevance. If they deem our labors irrelevant and replaceable, then we too, our bodies, are replaceable and dispensable in their eyes. And when human life is deemed so cheap and the human mind is forced to be useless, in an era where we witness unprecedented technological leaps and bounds, I ask again, how much progress have we made in the last 200 years or so? Is human life quantifiable by how much profit they can reap for another person? So, for all its sophistication, as of now, AI cannot replace the human touch that we give to our discipline. And it is woefully inadequate to understand the nuances of Black history or to even capture its complexity and richness. I do hope that AI will not be a substitute for humankind, for our minds. Education should liberate, and AI should democratize education, not replace it. That's my hope. Thank you.
We want to open up to questions. So you can get a couple questions, and then we'll continue the conversation with it. I can go along with the mic. Can we get the next question?
Do you have a question, Jose?
I do, but I'm waiting. Yes. All right, here you go.
I just wanted to ask, like, you know how AI doesn't have like the human emotion aspect? Is there also a flaw in like the logic that AI uses when talking about humanities and history as well?
You know, it is the thing that AI cannot do yet is to actually go into even online archival databases. So it cannot make evidence-based conclusions yet. So because it can't do the research itself, it can read all the stuff that is already online, but it cannot, for some reason, they've not yet been able to actually make AI go through an archive, even if it's online, and then pull out the necessary things that it needs to make an argument.
Good, great question. Anybody else have a question over here? Okay. Shane. Thank you.
What ways would you suggest that we could incorporate AI into like how we learn? That way, like our minds aren't like stagnant.
Um, I actually tell my students that they can use AI in when they're transcribing those documents because it has gotten really good at OCRing the documents. So even if it's like handwritten, I used it. I thought it was getting too expensive, and I was also concerned about the water issue. So I got rid of it. I use it to actually, I would feed it my whole data entry of Excel sheet and then ask it to look for errors. So even I'll ask it to put the coordinates that I needed because that's a very tedious process of finding out the coordinates to create a map. So when you create a map, you have to create an Excel or Google sheet first, and you have to put every latitude and longitude value on there. So it's so useful in that sense. But I actually, I've dabbled with its graphic stuff too. I've only used like a free stuff, but I haven't been able to find it like when it comes to art itself, not so great. When it comes to analyzing as well, I have this assignment in class where I give them a case about children fighting for their freedom, a freedom suit to free themselves out of slavery in Kentucky. I asked them to feed the whole thing, that case, to AI. And what happens is AI will actually summarize it, and it summarizes it pretty good. However, it could not read that because again, it's not human, right? That particular case that I gave them is very complex in a sense that the children's quote unquote owners is also their uncle, and it looks like he's trying to to enslave them in order to keep them within the family, not as a slave, but as a family, because Kentucky has laws that no Black person can live in Kentucky if they are free. And so these kids were stuck in an indenture, yet somehow, in a way that family was manipulating the law in order to keep them all together. If that doesn't make sense. It is a complex case that it looks like for all the uncle was doing slash the enslaver, it looks like he is enslaving the children in order to keep them actually free. To have the affordances of being free while on paper being enslaved. So when I fed that case to AI, it just couldn't find that human and emotional analysis that this is a case about family rather than just lawful enslavement. So I asked my students to feed that case, they talk about it, and then we talk about how it cannot find that kind of analysis that a historian would know, and as a person who has a family would know, right? What do you do to keep your family together, right? In spite of the laws that keep some of you enslaved and some of you not enslaved. So it's great in that sense, if you're not a law student, it's so hard to read these case files. Feed it to AI, it'll give you a summary, but do keep in mind, it's not going to replace your own analysis as a person with emotion.
And thank you, Professor De Vera. And to your point, Shane, I think your mind becomes stagnated when you don't ask that further question, right? If you don't question what you received from that ChatGPT or AI program, so that if you're not questioning what you got back from there, then that's you accepting that as for like value. Then that's where like you're not allowing yourself to expand and think and become more analytical in your own personal growth. Yeah. Any other question, folks? Who else got a question over here? Another question? No, yes. Martin, you have a question? Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm thinking about the pedagogical aspect. So, pedagogy meaning, thinking about teaching and the study of teaching. And And so one thing you said was, sort of to circumvent the AI, the use of AI, is like getting rid of the tests and the essays. So I guess my question is, what are the like effects of that? Do you feel like was there a big change in the student engagement or and how you approach the class? Because it seems like such a big change, but it seems like it might have been really rewarding. So if you could just maybe elaborate on sort of the results of that.
Part of that is why I did it is because the UC did put me in this very difficult situation of 4 TAs for 400 students, and it's not actually labor-wise, right? It's not fair to make these underpaid TAs grade 100 essays and 100 tests. That's not within their contract, and I don't want them to do that. The change was, many of you know that UCI tends to be quite, they call it socially dead. But, they made friends. I like the thing is, what's great about group projects and learning a skill such as mapping, learning that together is that you see some students take the lead, right? Like natural leaders in a way, and other people making sure the labor is equal so that you yourself don't have to worry about that. At the end of the course, they actually have to evaluate one another. So they gave each other 0 out of 10. I don't have to grade that, right? So I like the idea of collaborating and the students themselves learning how to be accountable to a grade that you will actually share. So that if one person slacks, I'll find out. And of course, they'll evaluate themselves. I just got my course evaluations recently, and they actually like the mapping workshops. They appreciate that, I can't do tests. I never tested well myself. And I think part of it is we do have to recognize that the diversity of learning abilities and disabilities. And I myself has ADHD. I've always wondered why I always forget things and how I never did well in tests. I write great essays. And so I wanted to tap into a different kind of learning ability rather than just memorizing, when did the Civil War end and did Lincoln die and all those. Yeah, so it has worked really well. As you could never, with a 400 student class, and many of them don't want to be there, you could never have 100%. This is great, never ever. But honestly, it has been the evaluations have been surprisingly kind, if I may say so.
Good, good. Thank you, Professor. And I have a comment and a question. I really appreciate you introducing the assignments that you do in your class. I like so I got a question about selecting the archives. Is usually your work from your personal archives that you've done over time for your research, but do you also use digital online archives with students? And the other thing too that I really liked is or a question, and then when you coming up with these digital online archives for your next class, do you think about the certain topics that are more popular at the time, right? Or like, and how do you connect some of this work with the present moment, right? When we're talking about like fake news or everything that's happening in our society, many times we one thing that we talked about in our class early on was like, well, we're going to talk about history, U.S. history in intro to ethnic studies class. We need to talk about having evidence and backing up our argument, right? And I feel like this is a great way of kind of like introducing the class to like how to use evidence and how to back up your argument and have an accurate history of what the topics that we're discussing. So a little bit of everything right there. Sorry, Samantha.
Yeah, that's a great question. But I will say that I don't ask an argument out of my students because I've learned that that is actually quite unfair for an introductory class. I want them to start at the beginning where they find evidence first. Right. So I think it's unfair to make as a first year student fresh out of high school and say, hey, write an essay with a historical argument. I mean, it took me forever to find out my argument for my dissertation. Why would I think that a student would know it in a quarter? So the whole class is really just about learning how to do historical research and finding vetted knowledge so that eventually you can come to be the person that can make an argument based on evidence. So, the maps themselves, you find all the archival documents there. You write a narrative, even if that narrative doesn't have an argument. But what do you see is happening here, right? Some of them see over time, cholera seems to taper out, da 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 da. So I start at the first step. And then in terms of archives, every online archive, I tend to scour a lot of archives online. But in this case, I just had like a lot of documents that I needed myself to be transcribed. So I used my students in that sense to do that. But I made sure that it's not just them doing work for me, it's that we are going to talk about this throughout the quarter. And in fact, that's what I did. I talked, the documents that I had were, relevant to the Civil War, relevant to prison studies, relevant to the history of Virginia. And so all those topics covered in my class. Yeah.
Any other questions, y'all, before we close up real quick? No? Okay. So we want to give Professor Samantha de Vera another round of applause. Thank you so much for the talk today.
Thank you.